Hello and welcome to the kickoff of the Big Read from Fishtrap from Wallowa County. I would like to welcome everybody on to our first, what do you call it? Our first Big Read live stream. So I want to welcome everybody who's here. I understand there are folks tuning in possibly from all over the country, but most importantly, our own Wallowa and Union County folks from Northeast Oregon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shannon McNerney. I'm the Executive Director at Fishtrap. I'd like to welcome you all again to the Big Read. The Big Read is, we are participating, I think, on our 15th Big Read program with the NEA, which is administered through the Arts Midwest, and we're really grateful to them for helping us bring this program to you. This year, we are celebrating Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea, which I am almost finished with. And in the part of this book, what we wanted to do was have a little discussion about whales and whaling, and reached out to some of the people in our own region and our community to see if they could help us out with that. Before we get going, I want to thank some of our sponsors and funders and who helped us bring this program to us. Most especially Community Bank, who is our own local bank, who is our title sponsor this year and has been for several years and has been a big part of the Big Read. I also want to thank the Oregon Arts Commission, again, the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, and Arts Midwest, and most definitely our own beloved Book Loft for helping make the Big Read possible. Also to all our many partner schools, Joseph Charter School, Wallowa, Enterprise, Imnaha, the Building Healthy Families Alt Ed School, our new schools in Union County, Eastern Oregon University, and all sorts of you from all across the country, including Middletown Public Library. So shout out to New Jersey if you guys are there. So thank you very much for joining us. I think this is going to be a fun program. I'm going to get out of the way first because there's a very important person I need to introduce who helped make this all possible. Mike Midlow, who is our Fishtrap's program director, has worked very hard with members of our community, the Big Read program community, and our board to bring this event to you. So without further ado, to talk to you a little bit more about what's going to happen today and throughout the rest of the Big Read, meet Mr. Mike Midlow. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Shannon, and welcome to all of you folks. It's great to have you be a part of the Big Read. You know, there's been so many challenges this past year in putting on events, and now we've seen what an exciting time it is for inclusion and accessibility when people from anywhere and everywhere can participate in programming like the Big Read and interact with folks. It's exciting times. The Big Read does broaden our understanding of the world and our communities and ourselves by the joy of sharing a great book together. And we've put together a bunch of events to support that. I just gotta share something with you here. Hold on for a second. Yes, here we go. This is Fishtrap's Big Read page at fishtrap.org, and I just want to show you a couple things before we get going. Our book this year is In the Heart of the Sea, as Shannon said. It's a whale of a tale. And what we've put together are a whole bunch of additional resources for readers, students, and families. There's music. Of course, this is today's event, but also going on today, Fishtrap is streaming for free the Hollywood film In the Heart of the Sea. You can go to our website and follow these directions and watch the movie if you're tuning in today, February 17, or tomorrow, February 18. And then for the next month, we have tons of different weekly events like how to make your own hardtack, sailor superstitions, whaling in Oregon, the golden age of whaling, sailor slang, and then the finale is with our author of the book, Nathaniel Philbrick. So I'm pretty excited about that. But what we thought we would do to kick off the Big Read is to give you folks an introduction to what whaling, the history of whaling and whaling in general. It was such a big part of American life in the 19th century and even in the 20th, and where is it today? And so we look to our very own Oregon State University and Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, seeking out who would be the person to do that. And I think we found just the perfect person. I want to introduce Dr. Lisa T. Ballance. She's the director of Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute and endowed chair of marine mammal research. Dr. Ballance comes to OSU from NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where she spent 30 years conducting research on cetaceans and seabirds around the world, including the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Antarctica, the Bering Sea, and the Mekong River in Cambodia. She holds a PhD in marine ecology and a master's in marine science. Her significant positions include director of NOAA's Marine Mammal and Turtle Research Division in La Jolla, California, chief scientist of NOAA's Eastern Tropical Pacific Dolphin and Ecosystem Assessment Surveys. That's the thing that provided the scientific basis for the dolphin safe label you see on cans of tuna in the grocery store. She's been awarded research funding from the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Navy, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and is the recipient of the Department of Commerce bronze and silver medals, NOAA Fisheries Supervisor of the Year, and cover feature of the Association for Women in Science. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Ballance and take it away.
Thank you, Mike, for that warm welcome. And I'm going to begin by showing you all my title slide. Again, my name is Lisa Ballance, and no further introductions from me. That was very generous, gracious introduction, Mike. I am absolutely thrilled to be here to kick off this exciting event and to talk about one of the most intriguing topics in the world that I operate in, the world associated with whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and that is simply the topic of whaling. I'm going to lead you through a number of different types of whaling today, and I'm going to start at the very beginning with the earliest whaling, which, as far as we know, dates back as far as 5000 BC. For about 3,000 years, between 2000 and 5000 BC, we characterize this whaling as Aboriginal whaling, which essentially means subsistence whaling, people just taking whales as they can to provide food for their families and communities. The Basques were the first to actually take this to another level by hunting large whales in an organized way and in an intentional manner. They essentially developed harpooning techniques, which date actually to the 1100s. Then they started to cross the open ocean in pursuit of whales around the 1500s. And by the 1600s, they had actually been the first of human societies to extirpate populations. And I'm speaking specifically of the Bay of Biscay right whales. In case you don't know where the Bay of Biscay is, here's a map to show you. It's this bay that is encompassed by France to the north and Spain to the south. So there used to be a very healthy population of right whales here. The Aboriginal or subsistence whalers in Basque actually took every last one. And I'll come back to that population a little bit later on in my talk. Aboriginal whaling continues to this very day. And when you think about and hear the term Aboriginal whaling, you might think about this type of activity as shown in this very fuzzy blurred picture. This is a whaling, Aboriginal whaling that is going on today in waters off of and around Indonesia. And as you can tell here, the methods are very primitive. These whalers operate from hand-hewn canoes, and they jump off of those canoes using lengthy harpoons with spears on the end, and hope that they can disable usually larger dolphins so that they can bring those back to their families and feed them. But primitive methods in Aboriginal whaling are relatively rare. Most Aboriginal whaling actually uses much more modern methods, modern weaponry, modern boats, motors, etc. And a good example of this is the Faroes pilot whale drive fishery. It is considered to be Aboriginal whaling because the pilot whales that are caught are not sold for commercial purposes, but they use quite modern methods. And a current hot topic right now that is actually quite close to home for those of us that live in the Pacific Northwest has to do with Aboriginal whaling. And this pertains to the Makah tribe that currently lives, the remnant of that tribe, in Northwest Washington. The Makah tribe has a treaty right to hunt whales, as they have done for many centuries. And the whale of choice for them is the gray whale, which is, as some of you may know, a very coastal species. When the Endangered Species Act was first put into place in the United States in 1972, whales like the gray whale became listed as endangered, and all US citizens were bound by the provisions in the Endangered Species Act, as well as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This meant that automatically the Makah tribe, although they had a treaty right to continue their gray whale hunt, had to apply for exceptions to take gray whales under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And this has been an ongoing back and forth between the US federal government and the Makah tribe. So again, those of us who live in the Pacific Northwest have been watching this develop closely. That's all I'm going to say about Aboriginal whaling. I'm now going to move into a type of whaling that is likely quite familiar to all of you, and that is commercial whaling. Commercial whaling dates to about the late 1800s, and there were a few developments that made it possible. The first of those was the development of explosive harpoons. These were harpoons that had an explosive device in the head of the harpoon itself, so that when the harpoon was driven into the whale, the explosive would go off, and obviously it would be quite disabling, much more disabling to a whale than simply having the harpoon head in its body. Another important development was steam-powered ships. This allowed the whalers to travel far and wide and much more efficiently than they were able to do when they were simply under sail power. And then the final really important development was air compressors. And they used these air compressors to pump air directly into whales after they had been killed. And this prevented the dead whales from sinking. Commercial whaling coincided with the depletion of many traditionally hunted and more localized stocks of whales. So this was a movement from that previous type of whaling that I mentioned, Aboriginal or subsistence whaling, which occurred throughout coastal communities, likely around the world, wherever whales came close enough to shore to be accessed. But as those human communities depleted those populations, it prompted more ocean-going travel and ultimately global travel in search of those whales. And then commercial whaling greatly increased in 1904, and that coincided with the discovery of vast stocks of whales in the Southern Ocean, the ocean around the continent of Antarctica, and the development of what we refer to as factory ships in 1925. Those are ships that made possible the actual cutting up and processing of whales on the ship itself without having to tow those whales back to shore. Commercial whaling was initially driven by the need for whale oil, which is an incredibly fine substance and was used in precision instruments such as watches and clocks. Subsequently, as artificial oils were developed for these types of needs, whales were continued to be commercially taken, but used for many other products. In the late stages of commercial whaling, products like pet food and makeup. So here's a quick schematic of the commercially harvested whales. And you can see that I have them listed here in terms of size. There's a size bar here on the top from 0 meters to more than 25 meters. And remember that a meter is about 3 feet. So the largest of the commercially harvested whales, the blue whale here, came in at over 25 meters. That's well over 75 feet. And then the whales continue through the fin whale, bowhead, right whale, sei whale, humpback, gray, brutus, and minke to the very smallest, which is coming in at a little bit less than 10 meters, a little bit less than 30 feet. Still a big animal. And I skipped over this one, the sperm whale in the middle here, which is the only one of these whales that is a toothed whale. The rest are baleen whales. Sperm whales were also hunted because of their large size, coming in at slightly more than 15 meters long, more than 45 feet long in this schematic. So these were the main cast of characters in terms of commercially taken whales. There were also in some locations and for some short periods of time, bottlenose whales and yes, even killer whales were taken in the Southern Ocean by the Soviets for a period of 3 years. But primarily the whales taken were these larger baleen whales. Now, without a doubt, the commercial hunting of whales in the 20th century represents what was, in terms of sheer biomass, the greatest wildlife exploitation episode in human history. Let me go into this a little bit more in detail and show you some data slides. This one shows you the officially reported world catch for all of the great whales. And these data were synthesized in 1999. What you see here on the bottom is a time scale from 1860 up through 2000. And on the left, you see a number in terms of thousands of whales taken. And this yellow line is just that. How many thousands of whales were taken through time commercially? And I'll draw your attention to the fact that obviously this was in the late 1800s when commercial whaling first got going. And the number of whales took a steep increase all the way through to about the 1960s, after which it dropped significantly. And I'll talk more about these trends in a minute. But right now, I just want to draw your attention to these two dramatic dips in the number of whales taken in the late, about 1918 or so, and in the early 1940s. Those drops coincide exactly with the two world wars, World War I and World War II, leading me to the conclusion that wars are obviously good for whales, if not for humans. Here's another slide that shows the same data, but this time represented in terms of species. So again, time on the bottom from 1910 through 1970, the number of whales in terms of thousands, 5, 10,000, 15,000 on the left side. And what you see by the different colored lines are the different types of whales. So blue whales are in yellow here. The number of blue whales came to a peak in the 1930s. Here's that drop associated with World War I, but subsequently the number of blue whales taken commercially jumped way back up. They dropped back down during World War II and came back up. But you can see that these peaks were not as high as the initial one, and ultimately the number of blue whales dropped. Why is that? That's because so many blue whales were taken that it became difficult to find them. And subsequently, the whalers moved on to the next largest species of whale, the fin whale. Again, we see a peak here in the 1940s, a drop coinciding with World War II, a subsequent peak, and then a sharp drop as fin whales too became essentially what we refer to as commercially extinct. Subsequently, the whalers went after the next largest baleen whale, the sei whale. Those numbers peaked in the late 1960s, and finally, the last species to be targeted was the smallest of all the baleen whales, the minke whale, which comes in the 1970s, late in this time period. And this is the last data slide that I'll show you about the number of whales taken. This represents the official cumulative world catch for all the great whales. Again, on the left here, you see the number of whales in terms of thousands. And this heavy line in the middle shows you time from the 1900s to the late 1980s. And the numbers in terms of whales taken, each species is represented by a different color, and the whales taken in the northern hemisphere are above this dark line and the southern hemisphere below. Again, you can see those dips in the number of whales taken associated with the world wars. You can also see that the vast majority of whales were taken in the southern hemisphere, and in fact, that was in the Southern Ocean around the continent of Antarctica, about 2/3 of all the whales taken through commercial whaling. And together in the northern and the southern hemisphere, this represents 2.9 million whales that were commercially taken during this time period. So by 1940, whaling commercially had been so successful throughout the world's oceans that there was the commercial extinction of many whale populations throughout the global oceans. And it was at this time that a body known as the International Whaling Commission was formed in 1946. The International Whaling Commission is an international body to provide for the proper conservation of whale stocks and thus make possible the orderly development of the whaling industry. And that's a quote from what we refer to as the IWC's website. And this small map shows you in dark blue the member nations of the IWC. There are a great many member nations. The primary activities of the International Whaling Commission are to review and revise measures governing the conduct of whaling, especially establishing limits on numbers and sizes and seasons for the species allowed to be whaled, and designating whale sanctuaries as these populations became commercially extinct, ultimately protecting some species. By 1986, commercial extinction of so many species and so many populations of whales had become so widespread that the International Whaling Commission declared a moratorium on commercial whaling for all member nations. In other words, no commercial whaling was allowed subsequent to 1986, deliberately to allow whale populations to recover. Importantly, there had been plenty of earlier restrictions or prohibitions placed on many species. And that was because many species and populations had been over-harvested and were declining in abundance. So some of these earlier restrictions dated to the early 1900s. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So essentially what I've laid out for you is the fact that commercial whaling took a great number of whales, but it clearly represents a failure of management because the abundance of whale populations globally declined to such an extent that they became commercially extinct even before the management actions could kick in. So we take this as a failure of management. And yet, as scientists, we have to ask this question or make this observation. Commercial whaling did set in motion a series of what we consider to be unintended, but highly informative experiments on the consequences of overhunting. So with that in mind, we can ask this question. To what extent have the large whales recovered since we stopped harvesting them? Now, there are some complications associated with addressing that question. For example, pre-exploitation levels are difficult to estimate. How many whales were there prior to the era of commercial whaling? Arriving at those numbers is difficult because scientists were not out there collecting data on such things. Additionally, current environmental conditions in the world's oceans may differ, and they may differ significantly from the past. This means that perhaps some bodies of some oceans are not able to support as many whales as they could in the past. And finally, management of whales occurs through identification of population units. These are referred to as distinct population segments and stocks. So those populations of species of whales are identified by scientists from data of extreme variation in nature and quality. So all of these factors complicate addressing that question of recovery. Additionally, basic life history traits of large whales complicates recovery. And what I mean by that is that whales are long-lived, some living 50, 70 years of age or even longer. They tend to have delayed sexual maturity, so whales tend not to reproduce until they're 5, 8, 10 years old, or sometimes older. And they have low reproductive rates. They tend to have one offspring per year, but not annually. Rather, they reproduce once every 2 or 3 years. So all of these things combine to make recovery rates extremely slow. Additionally, whales are migratory. And I'm not going to spend any time on this, but they do move back and forth from the tropics, where they spend their winters, to very high latitudes in the northern and southern hemisphere, where they feed during the summer. And this means that they move across ocean basins, and they move across the high seas as well as waters under the jurisdictional responsibility of many different countries. So protection is very difficult. All right, with that in mind, let's return to this question and ask who, in terms of whale species or populations, have recovered. And there are some success stories. The Eastern Pacific gray whale is one that I want to highlight here. It was greatly reduced by whaling, down from pre-exploitation sizes of between 15,000 and 24,000 animals. But between 1846 and 1900, an estimated as many as 15,000 were killed. So the populations were hugely reduced during that time. Commercial whaling for gray whales ended in 1946, and gray whales were listed as endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act in 1973. Subsequently, under that protection, population estimates based on shore-based counts documented a recovery of gray whale populations to pre-exploitation levels. And you can see that recovery here in this data slide, where in the 1940s, the population levels were very low, but they recovered, those population numbers increased through time to the point where then they leveled out at about 20,000 whales, at which time they were considered to have been completely recovered and removed from the endangered species list in 1994. So this is what we like to see, a success story, recovery under protection. Here's another success story associated with humpback whales. They are also a recovery success story. What you see in this map of the world's oceans are different colors of ovals. And each one of those ovals represents what we refer to as a distinct population segment under the Endangered Species Act. The blue populations are considered to be not at risk. The yellow are threatened, and the pink are endangered. And it was an important day on the 8th of September in 2016 when 9 distinct population segments of humpbacks were removed from the endangered species list. Although 4 remain endangered and 1 remains threatened, still, this is a recovery success story. Now, some populations of whales have not yet recovered, but are showing signs of recovery. And there are a few examples. Right whales, 3 populations off South Africa, Argentina, and West Australia, as well as blue whales, a couple of populations in the Northeast Pacific, right here off of the US West Coast, and possibly in the Northeast Atlantic. So the fact that we have some recovery success stories and a few populations that are showing signs of recovery have set up this expectation of recovery. And I quote from a scientific paper here, published in 1993, if whale populations respond to a reduction in population size as might be expected by standard population dynamics theory, then effective legal protection should be followed by recovery. However, there are a great many whale populations who still are not recovering. And those include 1 population of gray whales, 6 populations of right whales, 4 populations of bowhead whales, 5 of humpbacks, at least 2 populations of blue whales, likely more, and 1 population of fin whales. Why is this? Why are these populations not recovering despite the fact that they are protected? Well, there are a number of reasons, and the one that I'm going to start with here is population extirpation. First, let me define that term extirpation. I think most of you are familiar with the term extinction, which applies to a species. Extinction is when that species is entirely gone. No more individuals of that species exist anywhere in the world. Population extirpation refers to no more individuals existing in a particular population, which tends to be more regional. And we know that at least 10 populations from 5 different species have been extirpated, and they show no evidence of recovery or repopulation from elsewhere. Here is a data slide that gives you an example of some of those. And again, let me walk you through the slide. On the lower, below the slide, you see a time scale that runs from the year 1000 on the left over to the year 2000 on the right. So it shows you a 1,000 year time span. The colored bars represent different populations of whales. Newfoundland right whales in pink here, Bay of Biscay right whales in the flesh, and so on. And the beginning of the bar represents the year that that population was first whaled. The end of the bar represents the year that that whaling ended. And none of these populations exist today. So what you can see here quite clearly is that these populations are extirpated, and the time since extirpation or commercial extinction ranges from 40 years in the case of the lower three here, Gibraltar fin whales, South Georgia blue whales, and South Georgia humpbacks, to as much as 390 years in the case of Bay of Biscay right whales, which we talked about earlier in terms of Aboriginal hunting, Aboriginal whaling. Let me focus my next slide on this population, blue whales around the island of South Georgia in the Southern Hemisphere. This schematic came from a whaling vessel, and what it shows is blue whales killed in the waters around South Georgia. This stippled area is the island of South Georgia, and these numbers represent isobars that show you how many whales, how many blue whales were killed in these areas largely in waters around this island, largely to the north and to the east. And I'll just ask you to take a moment to think about this and think about what these numbers mean. In 1 month, December of 1 year, 1926, this many blue whales were killed. Now, this population of blue whales around South Georgia Island is entirely gone. And what can we take away from that? The lesson is that there is a lot more structuring of populations in whales within a species than we had originally believed to be the case. So extirpation of these localized populations will not necessarily be followed by repopulation. I will leave you in this particular case with a hopeful postscript. Some of us that have been to sea around South Georgia in the last decade have on occasion seen 1 or 2 blue whales. And a couple of years ago, a research expedition to the island of South Georgia found more than a handful. And this is a headline from a scientific publication that was put out just last month. Nearly a century after being extirpated, blue whales are moving back to South Georgia Island. So a hopeful end note for this particular population. Let me touch on a second reason why some populations may not be recovering, and that has to do with incidental anthropogenic mortality. Things like entanglements in fishing gear, ships striking large whales. We also know that pollution and habitat degradation aren't good for whales. Getting hard data on the degree to which they harm whales or prevent recovery is a little bit more challenging. But let me give you an example of North Atlantic right whales where the data are fairly clear. The North Atlantic right whale inhabits the northeast coast of the United States and Canada. It's dependent on coastal and shelf habitat, and it's a very slow moving, slow swimming species. Because of this, because they are so coastal and because they are so slow moving, they became commercially extinct very early, by 1700. At that time, there was estimated to be about 60 individuals in this entire species left. North Atlantic right whales have been protected since the 1930s. They are considered to be critically endangered and the population is declining. And here, this data graphic shows you the number of North Atlantic right whales through time. That was looking pretty good for a while, but in the about 5 years ago or so, that population started to plummet again. And the reason has to do with ship strikes and entanglements in fishing gear. This population was, in a single year, a known number of 17 deaths occurred because of these two activities. That population produced no calves. And at this point, extinction is looking looming in the near future for the North Atlantic right whale if something is not done to prevent these types of deaths. A third possibility for lack of recovery for some of these whale populations has to do with what I term here indirect effects. These are things like whales competing with commercial fisheries for prey. Often the whales will eat the same thing that we eat ourselves. Another example of an indirect effect is ocean basin regime shifts. And by this, I just mean that the planet is changing in terms of climate, and there are some pretty significant changes in the ocean physically and biologically. And whales, no doubt, are impacted by those changes. And niche replacement is another example of indirect effects, which I'm not going to go into today. And in fact, that's all I'm going to say about indirect effects, because as you might imagine, gathering hard data on the exact impact of these types of things on whales is tricky. But I will move on to one last reason for lack of recovery of some of these whale populations, and that has to do with something known as illegal whaling. Now, many of you may not know what illegal whaling is. Many of you may not have ever even heard of it. Indeed, those of us in the scientific community had not heard of or been aware of illegal whaling until a couple of decades ago, when a few scientists and I will say at great risk to their own personal and professional safety, revealed records that had been hidden, and they revealed the magnitude of illegal whaling. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. First, let me just define illegal whaling here, which is whaling that occurs in contravention of national laws or internationally agreed upon quotas, season, area restrictions, and other limitations. So essentially, there are regulations in place that apply to whaling, and illegal whaling is completely disregarding those regulations. By far, the best documented and to date the most egregious example of illegal whaling is Soviet illegal whaling. And I spoke a moment ago about how the magnitude of illegal whaling was revealed relatively recently. And as you'll see, those of us in the scientific community became aware of Soviet illegal whaling because of the meticulous records that the Soviets kept. The scientists that accessed these records included Soviets at the time, Russians today, and they revealed these records at great risk to themselves, but we owe them a debt of gratitude for what they have shown the world. So Soviet illegal whaling was global in scope. It occurred during an about 40-year period beginning in 1948. So I'll draw your attention to the fact that if it began in 1948, it means that Soviet illegal whaling continued up until the late 1980s. It consisted of 7 factory fleets with efficient catch and processing capabilities. So a factory fleet is essentially a large vessel, as you see here on the left, that can cut up and process whales. There are smaller boats that are launched from that factory vessel that go out and kill the whales and bring the whales back to the vessel. These largest ships were incredibly efficient. They could process 200 small sperm whales every day, 100 humpback whales every day, or 35 pygmy blue whales every day. Incredibly efficient. The processing, however, unlike previous commercial whaling days when much of the whale was used, in these Soviet factory ships, the processing consisted mainly of stripping the blubber off the whale and discarding the remaining carcass. The Soviets had an elaborate planning system where they set annual production targets, bonuses when those targets were met, and subsequent increase in targets. And this led to a rapid reduction of whale populations. So this schematic on the right shows you that an example of that planning system, where every year when a Soviet factory fleet left, it was given a target number of whales. If it caught all of that target, the ship's captain and crew obtained a bonus, 25% of the total that they were to be paid in this case. The problem is that that number of catches became the next year's target. So if they were able to catch that number, they got another bonus, which led to a gradual ratcheting up of the target number of whales to be caught every year. And again, it led to a very rapid reduction of whale populations. Whaling positions in the Soviet times were very coveted. And here you can see a photograph of a Soviet factory ship returning to her home port. And yes, that is crowds of people flocking to welcome her home. Whalers earned high salaries with the potential for huge bonuses. And the Soviets were quite progressive when it came to equal opportunity for women. Women were employed aboard these factory ships, and there was even one female captain. As I indicated before, the Soviets falsified their catch data. They submitted those data to the Bureau of International Whaling Statistics, but they preserved the true data for research and administrative purposes. And it was these true data that were accessed a couple of decades ago and have provided the basis for what we know to be this massive illegal whaling. Now, the worldwide estimate of the illegal take through the Soviets is on the order of 180,000 whales. Here's an example of one of those records where you can see the species of whale on the left, the reported number of whales taken, the actual number, and the disparity. So you can see that for blue whales, for example, the reported and the actual numbers are fairly similar. But for something like a humpback whale, less than 3,000 whales were reported to be taken, when in fact, they took almost 43,000. So it was this over-reporting of non-protected species that disguised the take of protected species. Additionally, about 80% of the data on length, weight, sex, and reproductive status in these records was estimated to be false. And collectively, we can say that illegal whaling can partly, or in some cases, fully explain the lack of recovery for many of these whale stocks. Now, I just have a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to touch on one last type of whaling that some of you may have heard about, but I suspect don't know much about, and that is scientific whaling, which is allowed through a provision in the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. The member countries of the International Whaling Commission are allowed to kill whales for research related to management issues. Scientific whaling was formulated in the 1940s, and the whaling nations that have used this provision of scientific whaling have included Japan and Iceland periodically. Probably the best case study for scientific whaling comes from Japan. And I'll touch on just a couple of examples here. JARPA, the Program of Scientific Whaling in the Antarctic, which began in the late 1980s, was initially focused on minke whales and expanded in 2005 to double the annual catch of minke whales and add fin and humpbacks. The objective of this scientific whaling was to examine age, health, feeding habits, exposure to toxins, and other characteristics of whale populations. There was also a scientific whaling program by Japan in the Northern Pacific that began in 2002. The annual catch included minke, brutas, sperm, and sei whales. It was defined as a long-term research program of undetermined duration, whose primary objective was to learn about feeding ecology, with secondary objectives to learn about environmental pollutants and stock structure. And between 1987 and 2002, more than 10,000 whales have been killed through these two scientific whaling programs. Now, scientific whaling in general has been heavily criticized, and it's been heavily criticized for a variety of reasons. First, feeding ecology, which was the goal of some of these scientific whaling studies, is not relevant to the current International Whaling Commission's management scheme for commercial whaling. Furthermore, this research lacks testable hypotheses and performance measures, uses selective or inappropriate data, geographic sampling, and analytical methods. The publication record for this science is extremely poor. And most important, scientific whaling has an unnecessary reliance on lethal sampling. In fact, for many of these research studies, non-lethal methods often provide better data at less cost to address those objectives. And in fact, in 2014, the International Court of Justice ruled that the special permits granted by Japan for the killing, taking, and treating of whales in connection with their scientific whaling programs are not for purposes of scientific research, and they put a stop to the practice of scientific whaling. The story has continued in roundabout and complex ways. Currently, Japan has left the International Whaling Commission and is continuing this program. And again, it's a complex and ever-evolving story. With that, let me bring my talk to a close with 3 thoughts for you all. The first is that whaling in a sustainable manner, and here I'm speaking not only of commercial whaling, but also artisanal or subsistence whaling. Sustainable whaling is the exception to date, rather than the rule. Second is the distinction between conservation and ethics, which is often lost in the discussions associated with whaling. For populations of whales that are threatened and endangered, whaling is indeed about conservation. But there are a lot of healthy populations of whales. And in that case, whaling is not about conservation, it's about ethics. And my final thought is that it is clear that whale populations can recover if we allow it. That means we need to maintain healthy marine ecosystems and manage threats. And then if hunting whales is allowed, we have to hunt sustainably. In fact, this is the prescription for more than whales. And I think this is really today's big challenge. With that, I'll end my discussion. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That was a great way to get things going, and sure bubbled up a lot of questions about just the nature of whaling. We're going to take a few minutes to ask some questions. If you were watching this live on Fishtrap's YouTube channel, you can type something into the comments, and we will feed it out to Lisa. But I do want to start with a question. The book we're reading for the Big Read, In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, is when a large sperm whale rams this whaling boat and swims off. And at the time, just the idea of the exploitation of species and resources, it's something that just plays on over and over and over again. And by the time this book takes place in 1819, 1820, and they had been whaling for a couple of decades, and each year they had to go out farther from the island of Nantucket until now they're going around Cape Horn into the Pacific Ocean. What do you think? What do you think sparked a cultural change by the 1970s, not only with one nation but in the world, to change those the values of, hey, we took all of this species of whale, we'll just move to the next one. We took all of this species of whale, we'll move to the next one. What sparked the cultural, I guess, ethical change worldwide to ban whaling? What did you say, 1973?
Well, yes, the Endangered Species Act was put into place in 1972. And your question is a really good one. I think there are a variety of things that really came together to create this cultural shift from one of exploitation and overexploitation, massive overexploitation, to one of preservation. And I think it all really boils down to public awareness. The Endangered Species Act was put into place largely because people became aware that millions of dolphins were being ensnared in nets associated with catching tuna, and graphic visual depiction of that, people didn't like that. I think that once it became clear to the public that whales had been overexploited and killed, and what magical beasts they were. I think, for example, Roger Payne, a scientist, made a record when I was in, grammar school, and it was the songs of the humpback whale. I think it's things like that that just elevate public awareness about the value of wildlife for wildlife's sake that causes this groundswell of awareness and ultimately permeates into national and international legislation and cultural shift. And to be fair, I think I really do want to point out that the whalers themselves are not evil people. Commercial fishers are not evil people. No one really wants to drive a species extinct or even overexploit it. It's just a mismanagement and a complicated, complex situation. And that is a challenge that we face even today.
Wonderful, thanks. We do have a couple questions here. Here's one that goes back to what they call a subsistence or Aboriginal whaling. I'm curious about any known regulatory or management practices in subsistence whaling.
Great question. Yes, subsistence or Aboriginal whaling does occur, as I mentioned. It's going on in quite a few different countries by quite a few different communities of humans. And some of that subsistence whaling is regulated under the International Whaling Commission. In those instances, the scientific committee of the International Whaling Commission reviews data on abundance of the populations that are being whaled in subsistence whaling, and they they calculate allowable kills for a particular population, a particular community of humans. So that community of Native Americans in Alaska can take so many bowhead whales, for example. So some of it is regulated and some of it is not. Some of it is more essentially pirate whaling, outside of regulation altogether.
Great. Well, we're coming up on at the top of the hour, but there's one more question here from Scotty D, watching via YouTube. It's kind of a great way to wrap up this this hour. What can you tell us about the new population recently discovered in the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, I love that question. It's a population of whale that was originally thought to be Bruda's whale. Bruda's whale is essentially, think of a blue whale. It's not as big as a blue whale, but it looks very similar. It tends to be more of a tropical species than a blue whale, but it's a large baleen whale. They're found in all oceans of the world, including the Gulf of Mexico, except a paper that just came out late last year has identified that population as a distinct species, and that is based on molecular genetics. It's very exciting. It's hugely exciting when we can identify and describe a new species of whale, and it looks that to be the case that this one is indeed very distinct. It's a happy, exciting story, except the Gulf of Mexico is highly susceptible to some pretty intensive anthropogenic perturbations. In this case, a lot of oil and gas exploration, which is located right where that population is known to be. It is already a vulnerable population, even as it is just being described. So watch this space closely for future developments.
Well, Dr. Lisa T. Ballance from the Hatfield Marine Science Center at Oregon State University, thank you so much for spending some time with us, giving us a little window into the history of whaling. And all of you out there for joining us. Pick up a copy of the book and join us as we continue on with 5 weeks of events and discussions. Get your book club to read In the Heart of the Sea. See what happens next. And if you're watching this live, you know, for today and tomorrow, the 17th and 18th of February, you can stream the Hollywood film In the Heart of the Sea through Fishtrap's website, or if you're watching the recording on the 18th, you can do that too. And then next week, we start off with a lot of different stuff. We're going to talk about how to make your own hardtack next Wednesday, February 24th, sailor superstitions, whaling in Oregon, and so much more. So go to fishtrap.org and learn all about the Big Read. Get in touch with us, and thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week.